A recipe for renewed unrest in Kenya. The Supreme Court verdict to declare last month's presidential election result null and void is unprecedented in Africa. Will the surprise decision strengthen democracy in Kenya? This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to the program. I'm Hashem, Ahelbarra. The President of Kenya has reacted to the Supreme Court's annulment of his re-election by saying there's a problem with the judiciary which must be fixed. Uhuru Kenyatta has also described the judges as crooks and thugs. His rival, Raila Odinga, who complained last month's vote was fixed, is calling for leaders of the Election Commission to face criminal charges. It's being ordered to rerun the election in the next 2 months, and pressure is mounting on the Commission to ensure a fair vote. Lots to discuss, but first, our correspondent Muhammad Adaw from Nairobi.
It's uncertain ground for Kenya. Nothing of this sort has happened ever before. Now, for the Electoral Commission, it's back to the drawing board. The Commission has been directed by the Supreme Court to organize elections within 60 days. It says it's willing to do that and has the capacity. But the opposition say they do not want the current Electoral Commission to organize these elections and that they want it disbanded and its officials charged with crimes committed during the last vote. Of course, this is something that complicates the situation further because it will take a long time to select a new Electoral Commission. Also, President Uhuru Kenyatta doesn't have the massive powers he has had to sign off on any new commission, which in essence means that it will take a long time. Now, if the opposition insists on its demands to have the Electoral Commission disbanded, then it will mean the election may not be held within 60 days. And at the point where things reach 60 days, the Speaker of the National Assembly will have to assume power and organize the elections. Of course, this is something that might put Kenya in even a deeper crisis.
Opposition leader Raila Odinga said leaders of the Election Commission should resign or face prosecution.
As a country, we urgently need to discuss how we will conduct the upcoming elections. As IBC itself has said, many changes must be made in the Commission before we hold another election. But this cannot be an assignment to be carried out by the Commission.
The Supreme Court ruling is an unexpected win for opposition leader Raila Odinga in a lifetime spent on the losing end of Kenyan politics. The 72-year-old has run for president 4 times and lost every election. A son of Kenya's first vice president, he's been twice imprisoned for his fight against one-party dictatorship. When he was prime minister in 2010, Kenya enacted its first constitution since gaining independence from Britain in 1963. Odinga alleged election fraud when he lost the presidential election to Mwangi Kibaki 10 years ago. His call for street protest escalated into fighting between rival supporters and tribes, which killed at least 1,400 Kenyans. Joining us on the panel today is Kimani Ichungwa, MP from the Jubilee party in Nairobi. In London, we have Alex Vines, head of Africa program at the Chatham House. And also in Nairobi, Paul Mwangi. He is the political advisor to Raila Odinga. Welcome, everyone. Let me start by asking Mr. Ichungwa this. We're getting here some mixed reaction from Uhuru Kenyatta. First, he says that he respects the court ruling, but then he lashes out at the judges, describing them as thugs.
There's nothing mixed with what President Kenyatta said yesterday. His speech yesterday, he said, one, that he does respect the decision by the Supreme Court as much as he disagrees with that judgment. Two, he was very emphatic on the call for peace, asking Kenyans to also accept that decision and to live with each other peacefully. That is different from what he's spoken about today, because today he's spoken about dismantling the corruption cartels and the cartels that seem to be running the judiciary in this country. I do not think there's anything contradictory between those two issues, because he has accepted to live with the judgment, as much as we do not agree with that judgment at all.
Mm-hmm. But then again, let me go to Mwangi. Mr. Mwangi, what do you think was the main reason behind this whole court ruling? Is it the discrepancies between the electronic results and the manual count? What triggered the judges to say, wait a second, we have to invalidate the election process?
Well, according to the law that was facing the judges, there are two limbs in which an election could be nullified. One of the limbs is if the election does not comply with the Constitution and with the electoral laws that are in place. The second is, of course, the numbers game. If an irregularity has been conducted that affects the results. The court, we do not have the full reasons of the court reasoning, but from what we have seen, from what they disclosed so far, is that they seem to have leaned a lot on the fact that this election did not comply with the Constitution and the laws. And that went into the way it was conducted, the documents and the way they were handled, the genuineness and the transmission of the results.
Mr. Vines, I think it will take some time for the investigators to connect all the elements of the puzzles. But however, what we know so far is that a senior voting technology official was killed 1 week before the election. Then paper forms were unaccounted for after the election. Then some of those forms that were presented lacked some security features. Is this talking about simple irregularities or something far deeper that could question the whole political process in Kenya?
Well, I mean, we're going to have to wait for the full ruling by the Supreme Court. They have 21 days now to publish that, and that, I think, will help us join up further dots once that ruling is published. But as you say, the information we already have in public does suggest that the broader context of the election, there are processes that are irregular, and clearly the Supreme Court judges thought they were therefore unconstitutional and have declared the election of August null and void. Hence, a new election has to happen in the next 60 days. So clearly the judges have looked at all the information and have decided that it is unconstitutional. I think this shows the robustness and independence of the Kenyan judiciary. And I must say personally, I do regret the President Uhuru Kenyatta's statements trying to undermine the judiciary. He's made two speeches now, which I think are chilling for the judiciary, given that they have been strengthened due to the weakness of judiciary in past electoral processes. So this is a step forward. We don't really want to step backwards.
True. Speaking of the irregularities and the judiciary system, Mr. Ichungwa, you know that the judiciary has been mired in corruption, inefficiency for decades in Kenya. It took the country 2010, 11 and 12 to start building a robust judiciary system. Now people are saying in Kenya, finally we can have faith in our system. But the president says and describes those people as thugs. Isn't this something that could undermine democracy in your country?
Let me begin by saying, one, I do strongly share the sentiments of the president. And true, the judgment yesterday is actually a vindication of our judiciary and many of our institutions, our constitutional institutions, as independent institutions. Be it the judiciary, be it the Independent Electoral and Boundaries Commission, these are institutions that this government particularly has allowed to run as independent institutions. And therefore, the president in the first place, having been in office and having his own very justified election that he won by a majority of over 1.5 million votes, being nullified by the judiciary, it tells you then that that judiciary is independent of the executive, and the executive has not in any way tried to interfere with the independence of the judiciary. But also a double-edged sword. You should be able to ask yourself whether the judiciary has been able to free itself and become independent of the corruption cartels that ran the judiciary in this country over the years, of corruption cartels that seems to even have interfered with this judgment and other decisions that have been made prior to this one by our own judiciary. And I want to tell you emphatically that our judiciary is yet to free itself from corruption cartels. It is still dependent on corruption cartels. And that is what the president is speaking to, that we must be bold enough if we want
this is
truly independent
Ichungwa, this is not what...
must not just be independent.
But this is not what your president said off the back of the election results.
Cartels.
It's just because when we are...
Sorry?
Unhappy about any statement or a decision, suddenly we cast all the doubt about one of the key components of democracy in Kenya.
No, remember, we're not just talking about these from yesterday. Even before the elections, we did speak strongly against the judiciary trying to interfere with even the date of the last elections. Remember, the coalition that we are fighting with, the NASA coalition, is one of the people who filed almost 100 cases or close to 100 cases prior to the elections, all designed to interfere or to put barriers towards the holding of a free and fair election. We must ask ourselves today as Kenyans whether it is not a travesty of justice that the Supreme Court can actually nullify, and not the results. Remember, they did not nullify the results. They did not look at the numbers. And elections are won on numbers. They nullify the declaration of the results.
Yeah, but at the same time,
based
they
on certain
said
technical irregularities, issues of barcodes not being there on forms, and any independent thinker should be able to ask himself. But
again, if you look at the ruling, the court,
irregularities,
Mr. Ichungwa, the court said yesterday that the Independent Election Commission failed, neglected, or refused to conduct the presidential election in a manner consistent with the dictates of the Constitution. Mr. Mwangi, what's next for you, for Odinga? Do you think that now he stands good chances to do what he failed to do in the past, which is get elected as president of Kenya?
First, let me correct an impression that is being created by Ichungwa. One of the audits that was done during the hearing of the petition was an audit on the ICT system. And that audit indicated that there had been interference in the technology and in the servers. In fact, during the court sessions, IEBC was ordered by the Supreme Court to give access to its servers and to allow people to look at the logs to determine the activities. They flatly refused to allow anybody to look into their servers. What they did was that they gave us copies of logs, and when we went through those logs, it proved that there had been hacking, and that in fact the KIM systems from the 40,000 polling stations never communicated with the server, and that results were being uploaded from 272 terminals. So there was evidence before the court, and those logs were also carried away by the
I see your point. Let's just move forward with our discussion. Do you think that that Odinga stands strong chances this time to win the election?
Yes, once you remove the rigging aspects of this and the interference, then he stands a very good chance of winning this election, this rerun.
Okay.
Just before the last elections, he had at least two opinion polls that put him up to 4% points above the president. And I think that especially now, people haven't seen what the Jubilee tried to do with their election, that he stands a better chance in
Mr. Vines,
at being elected.
The ruling of the court has been described as an unprecedented move, a step forward in democracy. But however, there are different layers to the political establishment in Kenya, because by the end of the day, we're still talking about political dynasties that call the final shots in Kenya.
Yeah, look, this is a watershed decision, this ruling by the Supreme Court, which has implications for democracy across Africa. Nothing like this has happened in Africa before. If you want to find anything similar, you've got to look at a place like the Maldives, I think, to have any comparison. So it has international significance too. I think the issue now is about moving forward. It is about having a credible process over the next 60 days and then to have an election. My own view is still that I think Uhuru Kenyatta probably could win an open election. And that's the challenge now for Jubilee and Uhuru Kenyatta to prove that the figures that they won in the last election are correct. And I have no reason to doubt that that's a possibility. But we need a credible election, and that will include reform of the Electoral Commission, which is something that NASA has been asking for. Clearly, there are questions about the integrity of the Electoral Commission. The biggest problem is reforming the Electoral Commission to have an election in 60 days. That's a tough task. And there isn't a lot of time. 60 days, the clock is already ticking.
Mr. Ichungwa, there's an escalation of the rhetoric. Kenyatta is lashing out at the judiciary. NASA is saying that the Electoral Commission should step down. Do you have any concerns that Kenya could be bracing for further violence and inter-ethnic confrontation?
Let me first even dissuade you from pursuing that thought that Kenya would be on a path to violence at all. We did conduct these elections in a very peaceful environment. You could see and you observed clearly that even post the elections throughout the judicial process, Kenyans were very peaceful. And that is why the president yesterday was very emphatic on the call for peace, asking Kenyans to maintain peace. And one of the things, the stark differences between ourselves, those of us in the governing coalition, and those in Mwangi's and Raila Odinga's coalition, is our emphasis and calls for national unity and peace. I did hear them yesterday say that when justice prevails, there is peace. True. But you need to ask yourself whether justice is only justice when you are winning, and it's not justice when you're winning. We did feel that the judgment yesterday was unjust to us. But the president, who was robbed of his win, did call for peace. And that is a challenge that is bestowed on us as political leaders, that at all times, whether we are aggrieved or not, we should call on Kenyans to maintain peace. Let me say violence comes about not because Kenyans want to fight each other, but because they are being incited by their political leaders. Raila Odinga's coalition has been at the forefront of inciting Kenyans into violence when they do not agree with a decision, either by the people voting or even a court decision. Remember, even as they went to court, I have reminded you that they went before the Supreme Court, intimidating the Supreme Court, that they had an opportunity now to redeem the Supreme Court. Number two, they did assert that they would not, they would still carry on with whatever other avenues they wanted to carry on with, irrespective of the decision by the Supreme Court. And that is clear. From yesterday, I did hear you ask Mwangi whether he believes Raila Odinga would still win this election. And you can hear how much he's fumbling around the question, because he knows, just as much as Raila Odinga knows, in a free, fair, credible process, they stand no chance of winning elections. Not in another 60 days, not even in another 50 years, because they have no agenda that they have taken to the Kenyan people to sell, other than the agenda of inciting Kenyans. They are called today and yesterday that they will not go into another election under the current setup of this IEBC.
Okay, Mr. Ichungwa,
it was the expected, because they are not prepared. They are not prepared for an election.
Okay.
And what they have been looking for is to instigate chaos in this country, to be able to get into some sort of caretaker government.
Got your point.
Mr.
Mwangi,
going to elections, because they are certain and they know they can never make it.
Okay, thank you. You've heard, Mr. Mwangi, you've heard all the arguments from Mr. Ichungwa. And in fact, there's a general sentiment among analysts, many people in Kenya, that Odinga's biggest problem is that unless he reinvents himself, reaches out to a huge constituency, there's absolutely no way he can win the next election.
One of the issues with the IEBC as it's currently constituted is that on one hand, we can't have a finding that the IEBC refused to give us a credible election, and then it is expected that with its full contingent of personnel who have failed it, that they will try to deliver another election. And Jubilee seems to be intent on having the same people run the election again, which of course would mean that you're going to make the same mistakes and commit the same frauds, and we are going to get back to the same results. And so I'm not surprised that Ichungwa and his group will be protecting the.
Can you answer my question about Odinga and his being unable to reinvent himself and come up with a message that attracts a wider audience to be able to become president?
I think Odinga's message has been very consistent. He stands for devolution, he stands for social welfare, he stands for grassroots development, and that has not changed, and that has been his consistent message throughout. He's not into PR, so there's nothing about reinventing the message. The message is the same. The problems that Kenya has had over the years are the same, and I think the solutions are still the same. And he is fighting for the same social justice that he fought for 20 years ago. And that has not been.
I see your point. Mr. Vines, Kenyans are going to go to another election. The last one cost a staggering $1 billion for a country like Kenya. Isn't this something that is likely to further strain the budget of the country?
Oh, completely. I mean, the last election was the most expensive ever held in Africa. The next election is going to be probably even more expensive, given that things have to happen within 60 days. So it is going to be very expensive for Kenya, but it is a really important statement of the deepening of Kenyan democracy. The markets have taken fright in the short term, and I think there'll be instability over the next 60 days. The shilling will weaken. There'll be a wait-and-see strategy of investors, which again is why this next electoral process needs to be credible to build up confidence. Because longer-term investors want to invest in Kenya, but they want a stable, prosperous, successful Kenya. And that's what these elections are all about. Okay, I have less than 2 minutes here, and I have one final question to both Ichungwa and Mr. Mwangi, but please set aside your political affiliations. Do you think that yesterday's decision won't be confined only to Kenya, but could spread, sending shockwaves across the political establishment in Africa? Let me start by Ichungwa first.
Let me say the Kenyan democracy is the most vibrant of the African democracies, and therefore we lead, others follow. I do expect that this kind of decisions, both in terms of the vibrancy of our democracy and the independence of institutions, both the electoral commissions around Africa, the judiciary, and other independent institutions, that many other African countries could take a cue from what we have done.
Mr. Mwangi.
The ruling for Kenya, yes, the ruling for Kenya was almost like a declaration of independence by the judiciary. Because over the years, we've lived with a judiciary that has always come under executive interference. And the judgment of the Supreme Court was almost a message that the judiciary was sending and saying that they are free now, that they will not agree to be intimidated, that they will say the truth and they will deliver justice, even if it means it is a threat to their lives. And of course, you have seen the kind of intimidation that has followed the ruling that they made. And I think this is going to reverberate also all over Africa. And other judiciaries and other judges in other jurisdictions.
It would be very interesting to see what happens next when Kenyans take to the polls next. Thanks to all our guests, Kimani Ichungwa, Alex Vines, and Paul Mwangi. And thank you too for watching. You can see the program again anytime by visiting our website, aljazeera.com. And for further discussion, go to our Facebook page. That's facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. You can also join the conversation on Twitter. Our handle is AJ Inside Story. From me, Hashem Ahelbarra, and the whole team here. Bye for now.